Hey everybody, how's it going? I just wanted to give you a quick update regarding this particular episode. Our guest today has provided a very generous offer. However, some of the details that were shared in this episode have changed, so please make note if you're interested. First and foremost, the offer has extended, but it's still for a limited time, so I advise you, if you're interested, please take action as soon as possible. The code too to use to take advantage of the discount has changed. It is also Indie Game Movement. So if you're interested, go to our guest website, plug in Indie Game Movement, and you could take advantage of that very generous offer. Or you can click on the link in the show notes, and that should be able to automatically plug in the code too. But if not, it's Indie Game Movement. Again, this is a limited time offer, a special offer that is only for you guys, our listeners. So if you're interested, head on over to the guest website, plug in that information, and take advantage of being such an awesome listener to the Indie Game Movement podcast. So that's all I got. So let's get right to the show. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about effective media strategies that stand out. Now, navigating the world of media relations can be challenging for indie game developers, often struggling to capture the attention of journalists and influencers, especially in the current crowded landscape. However, all it can take to tackle these challenges is a simple approach. So today, we're going to discover actionable strategies for establishing strong media relationships, crafting compelling pitches, and leverage underutilized channels that are effective and help you stand out among the crowd. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have George Osborn with us. And George, how's it going? And thanks for being on the show today.
It's wonderful. So I'm in the UK right now, and summer didn't happen until basically this week. So we've had rain, rain, and then the last few days have been sun. So everyone here is very happy, including myself.
Oh, that's great to hear. Because, yeah, I know for some people it's been a little slow. I know it was here for us. Like it was almost like kind of spring, and then it went into summer, and then now it's full blown summer. As I shared with you, that we're getting like temps in the higher 90s, or approximately 36 Celsius for those of you in other parts of the world. And yeah, so summer is all around, except for some of our friends that are south. I spoke with some folks from Australia, and they were like, one of them was, I think, a few, like 5 below Celsius almost, or 3 or something. It was chilly.
It's chilly, absolutely. And I also admit I've done the most British thing imaginable, which is start a conversation by talking about the weather. So thank you for indulging me.
Well, I'm not far from you, clearly, because I do it on a regular basis, and I am from New England, and that's a common trait here too for us New Englanders. But at any rate, folks, we digress. But George Osborn, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he is a managing director at Half Space Consulting. And I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit more about what that is too. But also another really cool thing that you're involved with, that a key component of, is you're the editor of the Video Games Industry Memo, which is such a informative and helpful newsletter that you put together. Lots of great stuff in there. I mean, also too, you've been the director at at Policy Communications, head of campaigns and communications through various other establishments. You've been a journalist, commentator, and presenter, and appeared in media such as like BBC News, The Guardian, Political, Bloomberg, and the New York Times, discussing, of course, games. So lots of cool things that you have going on there. Some other really cool accomplishments: MCV 30 Under 30, Games Industry Biz, Future 100, lots and lots and lots of other things. And on top of that, you do some really cool stuff too that I want to have you share briefly about. You're ambassador of Special Effect and you were the co-chair and trustee of Games Aid. You mind sharing briefly about those two initiatives that you were involved with?
Sure, of course. So, Special Effects is a charity that's based in the UK that adapts devices to help children, young people, and adults who have mobility challenges to play video games. And they've worked with some of the biggest companies around now. So, they've worked with the likes of Xbox and PlayStation. But honestly, watching their kind of life-changing work happen and seeing them go in to help people who are often having a really tough time because it may be a long-term illness, it may be a short-term issue. Being able to play is so important to their lives. So being able to support this wonderful charity by celebrating its work, talking about what it's doing, and occasionally doing a bit of fundraising for it is fantastic. And when we talk about Games Aid, so alongside that work, Games Aid's the UK video games industry charity, and it supports small children's charities across the UK that the industry selects. So it helps fund them, and it also helps give them advice about how to connect with the games industry. And over the last few years, I mean, my time there has ended, but we ended up raising about $500,000 for good causes. And, that's just a fantastic sort of testament to the potential power of the games industry to do good. So very happy to be involved in all of that. I'm very happy to celebrate their great work, of which I've only ever done a very small part, I must say.
Well, I absolutely love that too, because it just goes to show folks too that there's all these other initiatives relating to games that go well beyond than just simply the entertainment and business side of things, and how intrinsic and helpful it is becoming in our communities, in our cultures too. So it's great to always learn more about these types of organizations, and especially the people that make these types of things help, or at least contribute to these things. So in risk of sounding super cheesy here, folks, to make the world a better place. So.
Absolutely. Look, we all have our responsibility to do that, and it's great to be able to have these causes that match up with the things we love as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, real quick, I am a little curious, and I'm sure some of our listeners are too, in terms of what is half space consulting. Like, it's funny. I've been having lots of conversations with people. Like, there's all sorts of consultants and things like that. But what in particular is half space consulting? What do you guys do, and what do you help people with?
So what we help people with, so it's called strategic communications, but what I do is I do it at the intersection between the video games industry and the wider world. And the inspiration behind the business was I used to be the head of communications for the UK Video Games Industry Trade Association, UKI. And while I was there, I had loads of game developers talking to me saying, how do we tell our story? How do we come up with our plans to do so? And how do we do so in a way that reaches beyond just the games industry? How do we reach the mainstream press? But interestingly, on the other hand, I also had things like government departments, I had charities, I had non-government organizations who were saying, we know that young people and audiences we need to reach are in video games, but we don't know how to get there. We don't know how to speak to them. We don't know how to use the right tone, but also literally, we just don't actually know how to get that communication to work. So what Half Space is it's the organization that connects the two together and allows them to communicate. So from the game side, it's about helping companies who want to tell their story to maybe big mainstream press, again, like places like the New York Times. How do you prepare to do that? And then on the other side, it's about helping organizations like the United Nations Environment Programme, who are one of my clients, talk to the game sector effectively and go, let's build great relationships so that when we come around and want to do a big campaign around, say, last year's activity that they were doing, which was going to save animals in free wild habitats around the world, the game developers would get involved, fundraise for it, support, because these organizations realize the power of video games. They just don't know how to unlock it yet. And so that's what I help them do. And it's all about talking to each other. And so, especially around this, media relations and communication is so key to it. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to tease too much what this episode's about, but yeah, absolutely the case.
It's so great to hear because, again, it goes back to what we just shared a moment ago, that, a lot of what we do is very intrinsic, and we may not realize it, but as you called out to, other industries are looking to tap. I remember a while back, I attended PAX and I saw Geico branded everything for their esports channel. And I took someone aside and asked them, what's the main purpose and initiative? I had a pretty clear idea, but I wanted to see what one of the team members commented on. And I mean, now you see it everywhere, right? But you're absolutely right. communication, how do you effectively do that without coming off of, oh, it's a typical brand trying to just make more money? And that's might be sometimes the case, but definitely not always. These brands are passionate. They do care about people, and they want to do so in a meaningful, impactful way. And it's just great to know that there's people out there that can help with that type of communication. So, before we dive in deeper on communication and our main discussion topic here today, I would love to have you go in the Q box round. And for people who aren't familiar, that's just a few random questions I prepared for George today to get to know him a little bit better. So, George, are you ready for the Q box round?
I'm ready as I'm ever going to be.
Excellent. All right. First question is, what's one habit you do to keep a clear and healthy mind?
Running. It is easily the thing that I do the most to go and keep clear the mind. Literally before I came on this podcast, I actually went for a run to make sure my mind was clear. And it's that thing that I can do that gives me the time and the space to get away from everything. Literally, devices off, everything out the window, running in the landscape and just going, what am I thinking? Where's my brain going? And it's such a good way of finding out the thing that's at the back of my head. That's the reason why I love running. It's a great cause of clarity.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing when biking as well. It's just, like you said, it's crazy where your mind goes. And then all of a sudden it's like, wow. So awesome to hear. Next is, name one thing that motivates you every day.
I think it's just the fact that I'm doing something I love. I learned this at university. It was the person who was marking my essays. And at the end of one of the terms, they said, you're the most frustrating person I mark essays for, George, because your essays are either the best I read each week or they're the worst by miles. And it's really obvious that when you like something, you go into it really properly. And when you don't like something, you're just not interested. So the fact that I'm now doing something that I love, it's such a privilege. And I just don't think that I would be able to feel as motivated as I do to do everything that I did in my life so far, and I'm doing so far in the future, if I didn't actually just really love it. So yeah, simple, but very effective.
Awesome. And such a good one too. And last but not least, and the staple here on the show, is, what game are you playing now?
Well, it's a very modern release. And by that, I mean, it was released well over a decade ago, Fallout New Vegas. Look, I watched the Fallout TV show. I'd actually always bounced off the Fallout games. So Fallout 3, Fallout 4, tried to play them, never really got it. And a friend of mine was like, it's because you've not tried New Vegas. So I go into New Vegas and they're correct. There we go. That's the game I wanted to play. That's perfect. I just unbelievable level of choice and impact and influence over what you're doing. And also just funny. It's rare to play a video game that is actually authentically funny and interesting. So well done. Well done, Obsidian, I must say.
I think you're like the fourth or fifth guest now that is named some type of Fallout game and then also said, and I watched the show. I mean, I'm assuming there was a huge revival in playing of the Fallout series, but there's at least 5 of you that have been on the show now that are in that group. That's for sure. So I would say it's a thing. But at any rate, thank you so much for sharing those insights about yourself, and so we could get to learn a little bit more about you. But with that being said and addressed, let's get into the heart of our conversation, folks. And like I mentioned in the intro, today we're going to be talking about effective media strategies that stand out. So to kick this off, I'm honestly really curious, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you see for indie game developers when it comes to managing media relations today?
So I'm going to start off with the difficult stuff, because I think you've got to know the challenges to work out the opportunities. So I think the first challenge is simply getting heard. And the reason why it's so difficult is a lot of things that people are very familiar with. There are loads of games. There are loads coming out every single week. There are tens of thousands available at any given moment of time. And of those games that are available, some are huge titles that even years after their release, they're still dominating what people play. They're the things that people want to hear about. So getting yourself into that space is really hard. And it's really hard as well when the media market is under a bit of pressure. There's always been that sense that there are far fewer journalists and far fewer people creating news content and reviews and information than there are businesses who want to talk about what they're doing. So there's always been that problem. But I think over the last few years, if you go and look at both the games media, but if you look at recent research from somewhere called the Reuters Institute, which looks at what's going on in journalism, there have been layoffs, there have been challenges. It's harder to get through when there are fewer people writing about things. So you've got to be thinking about that. And then I think the final thing is like really understanding the value of it, because I think so many people think about media as going, media's great because it's going to help me sell games. It will help you sell games. Definitely that is true. But actually, when you're thinking about it in the kind of communications marketing mix, the big thing that media helps you do is establish reputation. And if you establish your reputation, that pays itself over and over and over again, because it means when you come around to launch a game, people want to listen. When you're looking at doing your next project, people want to hear more about it, including investors, everyone there. And then there's also that sense that everyone wants to organically talk about it. Reputation is a really key part of essentially virality, right? Is that if people know that you have a track record of making something good, they get excited, they get interested. So I would say like the biggest opportunity is understanding that value, because I think a lot of people don't. And I think when they don't, they potentially go in the wrong direction. They don't necessarily see the value of what they're doing. But then the other thing is actually just getting started, because I think sometimes media can feel a bit intimidating. It's something you don't control. It's hard to go and say, oh my goodness me, this person's so busy. How am I ever going to get any time with them? But actually, if what you do is you set yourself that goal of saying, I want to speak to a few journalists. That's all I want to do. I want to meet them. I want to chat with them for half an hour, have a coffee, a sit down, bump into them at a conference or an expo. You'll be surprised about how quickly that can start potentially generating value. Because as soon as someone knows where you are, as soon as someone knows what you're talking about, you massively increase your chances of them deciding to pay attention to what you're saying. So I would say the challenges are really understanding where the landscape is hard and really understanding like what the true value of it is. But once you understand those two things, you can begin to build nice targeted personal strategies that help you engage with media and help you get your story out there.
I absolutely love that framework essentially you presented, especially the point on understanding the value. Because I think a lot of times people may just say like you led off with like, oh, we need this because it gets us out there, right? And yes, that is true. But what ultimately is that value? How are you attributing that value to what it equates to? Or how do you really comprehend what that is? Because if you're thinking, oh, press equals wish list, it can happen, but it doesn't have the same sense of intent or purpose behind it when you're looking at what that value really is. And, like you said, starting somewhere is great, because ultimately, like you said, reputation, that's what it comes down to. But reputation also equates to momentum, and then momentum leads into all these other things, which is exactly what we want to do. But sometimes it's that mindset or that framework we're following that puts us in a different direction. So in terms of finding good directions, let's, talk about a little bit with maybe some establishing, whether it's mindsets or even just managing, relationships, right? Because as we're going through these things, trying to achieve, getting heard, there's got to be strategies that work and don't. So what would you say are some effective strategies that, some of our listeners, indie developers and studios can use to establish and maintain relationships with media professionals? Because that always seems like it's a struggle and a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the most important place to start when trying to build this strategy is to remember that media relations is essentially a very personal and targeted thing. Now, I think, again, another common mistake is someone goes, oh, I really want to do media because I want to get into X publication name. I want to be in IGN. I want to be in Kotaku. I want to be in that kind of place. That is a nice aspiration, But if that's where you're building your strategy from, you're going at it the wrong way, because those publications, very rarely will someone generically in that team decide to cover something. So, if we think about the way that media outlets work, there are some generic contact email addresses. There are ways to reach people. If you think about big national media, you can phone up a news desk and pitch a story and they'll listen to it. But those are almost never as effective as finding someone who is interested or likely to be interested in what you're doing, works at a place or a publication that you're interested in getting into, and telling a story to them that they're interested in hearing and interested in writing about. And so what that means is that instead of, you see people, I see as well, various things after a conference, various spammers trying to be like, I'm going to sell you a media list and give you hundreds and hundreds of people. That kind of spray and pray approach only really works if you're Microsoft or you're Nintendo, and everyone is going to write about what you're saying anyway. So it's just useful to get them in advance. If you're much smaller, it's much more important for you to sit there and go, okay, I want to reach 5 people. That actually means I need to find 25, 30, maybe 50 people at most to contact to try and talk to them. And that's not even to go, I'm going to send them a press release. That is to send them an email to say, hey, I read your piece about this particular game. I'm working on something similar. I'm going to be at these events. Would you fancy a coffee to come and have a look at this? Because, you're going to get lots of no's. You're going to get lots of people who are not necessarily going to look at it at the time, but you'll get a surprising amount of people who will go, yeah, I'd love to have a look. Because when you remember to be personal and targeted, you activate the fact that all of these journalists who are writing about video games are doing it because they love it. They really want to write about interesting games, and they always want to be the first on the scene. A journalist loves being the first person who discovers something. So if you are that person who is going to them in a really polite, really targeted fashion, giving them something interesting to look at, and then they suddenly go, is this the next big indie game? That they would pay you back in spades in terms of your overall sort of positivity, in terms of the value that they're going to put behind potentially covering what you're doing. So I think it's that sense of essentially moving away from that model of looking at media as just these big platforms, and instead to go, how do I reach the people who make those platforms work? Because if you can influence those people, that's much more likely to help you get coverage down the line.
I like that approach too, because I feel that it goes back to the other thing that you responded with in our kickoff, which is understanding the value. But in this time, it's looking at it from a different perspective. It's like, what are the value of these, influencers, press, whoever? What's the value to them? And if you're doing the spray and pray, like, there's a lot of people that will see no value in what you have, even if it is maybe up their alley, unless of course maybe you're Microsoft or some big entity. But even then, it could be a possibility that may not happen, right? Just more likely for them. But understanding that value and really keeping it personal, like, how many times do people, publicists and such, get spammed, right? There's no value there.
No, absolutely. and this is the thing is, I think it's important. It's important for a business to make sure, especially a games business who wants to get covered, you do want to generate stories, and you want to generate moments where you can give people an excuse to cover what you're doing. So, that game announcement moment, a big update that shows you where you are in terms of the progress, a post-launch thing, it's like you want to build those beats in. And people understand, everyone who's working in the press and the media completely understands that's exactly how the game works. And actually, that's what consumers are interested in. So that's cool. The key thing that you've got to do is learn how not to dilute your voice. Because if what you're doing is you're hitting loads of people who you've not built great relationships with loads and loads of stuff, well, they do what everyone else does when you get hit by loads of things. You zone out, you stop listening. And what you do, and I've seen this myself when I've basically done the journalist side of things as well. I start seeing people's press releases and go, not that interested. Whereas, as a kind of an interesting counterpoint to this, when I was at Yuki, I used to work a lot with national press, and I can remember speaking to a national media journalist in the UK, and they said, the thing I appreciate about the way you work with me is you contact me once a year, and you contact me once a year with something I'm interested in. And so I always cover it, because I pick up the phone to that one journalist once and go, so I've got this thing for you. I think it's really interesting. And I think actually this is right on the money with what your audience wants. And he goes, yep, that's perfect. Because I put that time and effort into doing it. But if I was sending in press releases constantly and bombarding him with stuff, chances are he wouldn't have had that opinion of me. So it's about how you strike that balance, between maintaining a relationship, but talking about what you want to talk about. And there are ways to talk about what you want to talk about that don't involve you going straight to their inbox. That's where your social media strategy comes in, your advertising strategy, and working with other things as well. Like, we've seen all the recent game showcases. That's another great way of getting in front of the press. So yeah, I would say it's about those relationships first, but it's about how do you maximize the value when you really need to talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely love it. Like really honing in on being personable, but also being targeted. And I think even though it probably balances out, because if you're sending out emails to hundreds of press, I mean, even though, especially if it's a canned approach, think of, it's probably going to break even time-wise, maybe a little bit more to be more targeted and personable with, let's say, a portion of that list. That really makes a lot more sense and clearly creating more impact. With those things too, though, let's say we talked about relationships and the importance of them. And I think we clearly conveyed that. Let's say we're getting to that point now. We've established some rapport or relationship. What are, some key components then that make a successful media pitch? Just because we're friendly and they're friendly with us doesn't necessarily, guarantee anything. So what are good ways to make media pitches to these people that could potentially help us out?
I'm going to give you an answer initially that sounds so obvious that I have to say sorry, but it is have a good game. And I know that is so obvious. I know that people will be sitting there. I mean, they're probably listening to this rolling their eyes as I say it. But ultimately, in the end, consumer games journalists are, for the most part, looking for good, great video games to be writing about. And if your game's not there, it's not going to get covered. Or if it does get covered, and I think we'll come down to how you deal with some more negative sides. It's not necessarily the positive thing for you that you would want. But I think outside of that, I think it's really about getting a tight pitch around what the game is as your kind of first element of it. So I think really making it clear pithily what's unique and what's interesting about it. People have often talked about the sort of the formula where it's like, a certain type of popular game that you like and a certain genre. It's basically just like Balatro is like Slay the Spire for poker, right? It's that kind of thing of going, it really quickly unlocks a few things in that person's mind to go, okay, I've not even played it yet, but I get what you're doing. Having that in mind is really, really key. And then alongside it, having everything in place to explain it really quickly and easily, even better. Your website, your press kit, your assets, your video, you've got to make sure you have as much of that in place as possible and make them as tight as you can so that someone who has a few minutes to look at what you're doing goes, okay, I'm interested in hearing more. So you have that pithy pitch, you have the assets that support it. But then I think the component that a lot of people miss, and I think it's a really great part of successful game pitches and game stories, is making sure that you tell your story too. I think one of the big things about video games that I think has really sort of advanced over, I would say, the last 15 years or so, since games became so much easier to distribute across the world from anywhere, is we're always fascinated to hear about the people who make them. We're always really interested to hear who's made them, why they've made them, what inspired them, and the classic media thing, almost what problem does it solve? What's the thing that's been missed? Because if you can do that, again, I'm going to go back to Balatro because I think that's been one of the games that's really been front of mind. Balatro has essentially a mysterious one-person developer working behind what it's doing. But that story of a one-person development team successfully releasing a really great game and doing it in the market when actually, video games industry has been struggling for a bit, it's been such a palate cleanser. And everyone has wanted to write about that. And so I think, you look at other successful games across the world, you look at things like Untitled Goose Game, and you look at the work their team did there in terms of, yes, they made a great game, but they also made the really interesting decision to have at the end of it a reference to what was going on amongst native Australians and the damage that was done to them. They used their game to make a really interesting, educated political statement. And that actually encouraged more people to go, I want to talk about this. So I think it's that sense of have a great game, have a pithy pitch, have great assets, but never forget your personal story too, because you might feel like it's not something you want to talk about. But when you get to the point of building those personal relationships, becoming a person yourself or becoming people as a team, it's really important. And it really helps you to especially get an edge with the media, because they always love it when they can quote someone and get someone on the record. So if you're willing to be a person and a personality, that can really help.
Yeah. And I absolutely love that last part that you really called out to is, the story. I mean, yes, we know, make it super simple for anyone, especially the press, to get and dial in more with this. But, a story, journalists know very well how effective a story is in getting eyeballs to reaching their goals, the publication's goals and everything. So if there's a good, compelling story attached to that, and it doesn't mean you have to over elaborate in these interactions either. It just means to quickly communicate that. And I know some of us listening are like, well, I'm kind of simple life. Like there's no real story, but what's the passion? What's the drive to create these projects? Maybe it could be something based off of your culture or where you're located that was a very challenge, and your passion drive was to prove yourself in this space, in this genre, because there is no community for games, and you wanted to be one of the first ones that stand out and to show to everyone else. I don't know. Yeah. I'm sure that's maybe a more universal one that people can relate to, but that's something. And then dive deeper. What else?
Absolutely. And I think that point about universality and relating to stories have been a part of human society since pretty much human society began. And the reason why is because people's brains work that way. If you look at things in terms of cognitive neuroscience, there is a reason why stories are so effective. It's because it helps people to take the complicated nature of the world and bring it together. So never be afraid to tell a story. And as you say, lean into things that you might not expect in terms of your background or areas like that for your benefit. One of the favorite stories I pitched again at Yuki was we were doing a report about how much money video games provided to different parts of the British economy. And it's kind of dry, like interesting, but dry. The numbers were there. And it's like, right, how do we bring this to life? And so what we did was we had all the data, but then I worked with Microsoft to get the team who made Forza Horizon in a place called Leamington Spa to go and do an interview with a journalist, because Leamington Spa used to be a place where people made real cars. So it's places where Ford had their factories and things like that. And that's stopped. That's become less of an important part of their economy. But you now have Playground and Codemasters there making virtual cars. So the story was, how did Leamington Spa go from making physical cars to digital cars? And that is something that's much, much more interesting than just, here's some numbers on a spreadsheet that have gone up. It's like people go, cool, okay. But, and as a very final point on this, because I know we do need to get onto it as well, there's one final way of thinking about this in terms of how journalists cover it. So the BBC have something called the zoom out model. And the idea is you have, say, a big piece of data. So, for example, let's say it's a piece of data that shows that people are struggling to pay their bills. And this is meaning that they're struggling to live. What they do is they go, Jane is a nurse in Birmingham. She works long days. She supports the NHS. She does all of these things, the National Health Service that is in the UK. And she does all of this, but she can't pay her bills. And this is making her stressed. A new piece of research, zoom out, and then they show you the data and they show you that. So being the person is a great way to be the sort of the focal point of your story. And then it can zoom out to look at your game, your company, what you're doing.
Awesome. I know. I love that line right there. Be the person, right? Because I think a lot of times we don't necessarily look at these things from that approach. I mean, we're still working with people, whether we're reaching out to people to cover our games, or whether they're communicating these stories to others. They're not just readers, they're people. So what is that intrinsic thing? That's the kind of the common denominator here, right?
Absolutely.
And how we communicate these things. Real quick, because I know we still have a bunch of things we'd like to cover today. We talked a lot about like journalists and stuff, and I know some in the industry, some people feel different about press and that, but you know what? Regardless of what those feelings are, and then the opportunities that they have, there's a lot of other sources too. So I'm just curious, like, for, developers out there, how can they also tailor their pitches, let's say, to different types of media, whether it's like a blog post, podcast, YouTube, influencers, any number of things. Like, what are good ways to go about that? Because in a way, while we feel like it could be hard to be heard, there's still lots of channels out there to be heard. So what are good ways to approach some of these other, forms of media?
Absolutely. So I think the first one is know what your format is and understand what that format requires. So what I love about this podcast and what I love about doing this with you is I actually have the time to talk about things and think about things. If I compare it to live TV, which I've done a few bits and pieces for and trained some people for, a live TV hit is between 3 and 5 minutes. When you factor in the other person asking questions, you have about 300 words. You've got to really get your point across. You've got to be like, bang, bang, bang. Here's what I want to say. Here's how I'm going to say it. I actually kind of don't care what question you've asked me because I've just got to say the thing that I've got to say because this is all I've got. So I think about that format and go, if you're talking on something like a podcast, you can take more time, take that opportunity to think about what you really want to say and develop it. If you're going off towards places more like, especially blogs, if you're looking towards things like Substack newsletters, which is something that I write as well, writers there have more independence, they have more space and flexibility to tell the stories. So again, you can probably sit down for an interview and be a bit more verbose, spend a bit more time talking about things. But if you're speaking to like big media, or, sort of a big mainstream out there, chances are they're going to use a couple of lines of what you're doing. So always keep an eye on that point of what's going to be that one line, what's going to be that sound bite that they're going to pull out, and always plan for that. You can, one of the things that definitely big top tip for any company is to spend a day writing down what your key points are, putting them into just a very simple line book. It doesn't have to be more than a few pages, and just knowing those off by heart so you can just recite them at the drop of a hat. But otherwise, the other two main things that I'll just say about this, one is try not to spread yourself too thin, building essentially media relations and with relations with these other kinds of creators too. It can get overwhelming quite quickly. So try and focus on, especially, to begin with, when you're trying to think about how do I reach consumers, those B2C outlets, the business to consumer ones, those are key. And then I think as well, understand some difference in dynamics between creators and press. So if you're thinking about things like YouTube channels, Twitch streamers, if you're thinking about TikTok influencers, they do pick up content organically, but they're also quite familiar and quite used to working in paid partnerships with people. There is more of a potential for a commercial relationship there, which is something you have to negotiate during your kind of interaction with them. Whereas press, if you go up to them and say, do you want a bit of money to cover the game? Or that's going to go down badly. You are going to land yourself in the wrong place. So I think just understand the format, understand the dynamic in terms of how the people who manage that format actually sort of pay their bills. And just remember as well, keep still that principle of being targeted in mind, because, in the end, you don't want to get yourself spread too thinly, because, you're not going to be able to take every opportunity or do them as well as you like. And when one of the big things about media is you don't necessarily control what comes out the other side, I think it's always better to have quite tight control over what you're doing until you feel comfortable to go further.
Yeah, such great points. I couldn't say it better than myself. Because, really, I mean, when it comes to these situations and everything we do, it's always important to have that level of control. And there's a lot that you can do, but in the moments that you don't, prepare so that, in a sense, you are maintaining that control even in the situations where you don't. And the perfect example you said too is like, sometimes they'll take the sound bites, and next thing you're like, wow, this is really out of context. We've all seen this before, right, folks? So, but if you really have that dialed in and maintain that, there you go. You're maintaining the control even in situations you don't. And it's great because then you don't have to worry, because when you're out of control and we worry about that too much, all sorts of problems can happen. Okay. So, lots of cool things here. But now I want to kind of go into a little bit more about how can we really leverage media relations, in particular, like what are ways we can really maximize the impact from doing these things to begin with. So in a crowded market, and let's just face it, it always feels like we're in a crowded market. How would you say that, like, indie games, can stand out to journalists and media outlets? Like, I know we might be revisiting some stuff, but like, what are some other specifics maybe you could share?
Yeah, I mean, again, that thing around stories, good pitches, great games, that's always going to be really, really useful. But if you're talking about ways that you can really specifically stand out, I'd say there's probably a few things. So I think one of the things that you can do is really identify what's unique. So, really understanding what's the system, what is the art decision, what is the writing decision that makes your product, your game unique. I think that's so important, because if you think about the way, I mean, I think about this in terms of the Zelda series, right? Wind Waker. What makes Wind Waker unique? It's the art style. It's like you immediately talk to someone about Wind Waker, and that is almost certainly the first thing that they go to. And so I think it's about going and sitting there and going, if I've got all of these potential rivals, what's the one thing that I'm able to talk about that's unique? I think that's key. I think the next thing as well is just really taking that moment to try and show people behind the curtains a bit, because the video games industry is massively opaque and it's actually quite insular and secretive. And I understand that part of it's about maintaining the magic, part of it's about maintaining secrets. But, I was reading recently, Substack sends out advice to writers, including writers like me, about saying what kind of content performs well. And they say, anytime that you do shop talk and you tell someone something about an area of the world they're interested in that they wouldn't otherwise know about, that can really help. So if you have something like a developer blog, which you're doing from time to time, just giving people updates, talking about challenges, think about bringing some of those thoughts into your media conversations, because it is always so fascinating to someone as someone like myself who loves games, but if someone said make one, I would cry probably. It's actually really interesting to hear from a developer to go, oh, how did you do that? Okay, how did you balance that? So I think that's it. And then just a very final one. I think it's kind of two interrelated things. So I think that the easiest one is just be available, like be easy to approach. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I've managed to either wangle my way onto like TV or into a newspaper or got a client or got a business into it on the basis that a journalist is told, you got 4 hours to file copy on this, and it's a video games topic. And they go, oh my God, who do I know who knows video games? And they go straight through their phone, and it's me. And it's like, George, help me. And they're on the phone, and I'm like, give me 10 minutes. I'll come back to you with something. Being available is just a huge way to get yourself ahead. And, when you're thinking about it, it doesn't always have to be around what your game is doing. So, you see things like, if you go into a lot of the trade press, they have things like round tables where they ask a question and then 10 people chuck in their thoughts on it. If you can find a bit of time to be available for those kinds of things, you just grow your reputation in the space. And when you do that, people are much more interested in, when you get around to your moment of, say, I'm launching a game, they go, interesting. You've had something to say elsewhere. I'm really interested in seeing where this goes. So yeah, I think in terms of those standing outs, it's like, know what's really unique about what you're doing. Make sure you show people behind the curtain. And I think as well, just be accessible. It's really useful.
Yeah, I absolutely love that last one too, because I mean, like, think about it. You develop these relationships and you make yourself available in those moments. I mean, it reminds me of that site, Help a Reporter Out. Like, that's why that exists, because I need a story or something. But if you're the first person that comes to mind because, hey, I shared this process, story, whatever it is, now I can go to them, and then boom, these things, they're more likely to happen in those cases, and they're going to remember that too. So absolutely love that. Okay, when we talked about, hey, getting out there, standing out and everything, we get to that point, and then, oh shoot, there's some negative press, there's some criticisms. What are some kind of ways to counter those situations?
So the first thing is, again, remember what media is. So if you think about it, like there are lots of models in terms of marketing and PR, but the biggest difference here is basically between earned and owned. It's like, if you're thinking about it, owned is things like your newsletters, your blogs, and everything like that. Earned media, it's just in that space. But by that sense of being earned, it means you have less control over it. So when you are engaging with media, you do so on the understanding there's some risk there. More risk than if you're doing something in your own channel. And the trade-off is there's some risk there, but if it goes well, then obviously I reach the audience, fantastic, and I get potentially credibility, which is great. But sometimes it's going to go wrong, and I think that's the thing, is that the reason why it's important to know that is because, first of all, it means you don't panic. Because I think the first thing that goes wrong when you get negative press or criticism is people start panicking. It's a very natural part of the process. It's a challenge. It's something you've got to deal with, but you've got to deal with it calmly. So first of all, understand that, yeah, it can happen. Then have a plan for dealing with it. So, sometimes, especially if it's around corporate reputation issues, like, you're worried about, say, something bad happens within your business and it goes out into the public realm. You can actually prepare for those kinds of things. It's really important to know the values of your business, how you work, and ultimately what you're going to say and what you're going to do if those kinds of things develop. So, as a small company that's growing, it's the reason why the things around HR and policy actually gets quite important quite quickly, because if you've got those things in place, you've got the defenses when someone comes to you. It's like if someone says a bad thing's happened, you go, yes, a bad thing has happened, but here's the steps that we're going to take to fix it. Because most of the time when people see a negative story, what they really want, the person who's writing it, is a sense that something's been done about it. It's that reassurance, it's like customer service. So I think having a plan for it's key. But I think the other thing as well is to remember to learn from it and listen. So I think the temptation is to go, put your fingers in your ear, start, humming and pretending it's not happening. And that's the wrong way to think of it. The way to think about media relations and these kinds of things is it's a dialogue. And so, yes, you're talking to someone, but they talk back to you. And provided that that person is not unreasonable, has not done anything unprofessional or unethical, for example, if they've not given you right to reply, but they've written something horrible about you, in terms of like a story about your business, or they've given your game a negative review, but for a fact that, ultimately, in the end, they've maybe played, I don't know, an earlier build that you sent through earlier, and they're saying that's the final thing. Unless there's that very obvious error, use the media conversation there and the criticism as a listening point. Learn something from it and make sure you feed it back into what you're doing. Because when you do that, you absorb the challenge, and then you are able to use that energy much, much more effectively to do positive things in the future. And yeah, it's horrible when it happens. I've had to deal with a lot of negative press, especially, being essentially the person who did communications for the video games industry. So violence, addiction, gambling, concern, all of those kinds of things. And it's horrible when it's happening. But keep calm, listen to what's going on, and make sure that you really understand whether you need to adjust or change the results of it. I think that's the key thing to do.
Yeah, and I think the last point too, in maybe let's say an indirect way, kind of reminds me of a famous quote that I'm paraphrasing from, I think, Mad Men, Don Draper, where he's had a conversation saying, if you don't like the conversation, then change it. But yeah, I think in order to effectively do that, you have to do those things like really listen, learn from it, and then take it and put it on that positive note to, I would say, probably execute that effectively.
Absolutely.
With all that though, we talked about like, hey, how do we address these negative situations? How do we really stand out? We got this information and frameworks that you so kindly provided us. So what are things that we can maximize these things even more? Let's say, maybe by understanding trends. And are there, like, let's say, any current trends within media relations that we can take advantage or should be aware of?
So I would say there definitely are. I would say if you're listening to this podcast and you're really nerdy about this, go and search for the Reuters Institute and their most recent digital media report. It came out literally like last week. And what it does, it looks much more widely than the video games media, but everything in that report is essentially what's going through the video games media at the moment. So that's the nerdy answer if you really want to go and spend a few hours looking at 100 pages. But if you want to look at what's going on in video games specifically, I'd say there's probably three things. So I'd say the first one is traditional games media is consolidating. It's starting to come together. You had IGN bought Gamer Network, which includes the likes of Eurogamer, Rock Paper Shotgun, GI Biz. What's happening there is essentially the historic model of video games media of you've got a website and you've got a load of ads supporting it and people come and discover it through search, and as a result of that funds what you're doing, and then you do some bits on the side. Essentially, it doesn't work or it's not working as well because changes to things like SEO as a result of Google messing around with AI results, and the fact that people access their news differently means that people are not going to games websites as much as they used to get their news. So instead, it's leading to two things. So the first thing is that those entertainment brands are starting to become platforms. Their name is, they're still attached to a website, but also you're seeing IGN pop up in all of the social channels, especially in places like short video with dedicated content there. So they're starting to think about how do we build the platform beyond just our traditional model. But then you're also seeing, as a result of that, new spin-outs coming in the creator economy, where you're seeing the people who are like Stephen Totilo, Nathan Brown, who have got their own newsletters. Simon Carlis, Game Discover Co., brilliant newsletter, where they have been able to build new content channels which function very similarly or exactly the same as media does, but using new business models where maybe it's subscription funded, maybe it's funded through accessing a wider service or data that they've got in the background. But ultimately, it creates this new sort of way of the media functioning. And just as a final thing about that, it's kind of pinned around a trifecta. And I think it's the three things I think are really shaping where people get their news now. Because social media is less useful for finding news because Facebook is throttling it and X is rubbish. People are now getting their news direct to them in other ways. And the biggest ways are through short video. So you're talking TikTok, Instagram Reel. So watching, listening, podcasts, what we're doing here, and then their inbox newsletters. And so when you're thinking about that, it's like those are the things that I think you really want to be looking at. You want to be either looking at publications who really get that mix and are doing some of it. So consumer outlets who are really good on short video and do a great podcast, interesting place to go. But I think as well, just thinking about the fact that your traditional games media, they're still obviously significant and influential, but you might have a lot more opportunity if you're going to these people who are creating these newsletters, these podcasts, these short video channels, and feeding them directly. Because as they're growing, they need sources of information, they need interesting things to write about. And if you hand them something really great to write about, then they're going to go, oh, thank you very much. And I think the best example, I've already mentioned it, is Simon Carlis with Game Discover Co., where he has managed to build an enormous amount of success out of having clients, contacts, games businesses tell him what's happened with their game on Steam and say, we experienced this. And he interviews them, and then it goes out to, I think it's now about 25,000 people, right? So you can reach big influential audiences of the right people you want to reach. But I think one of the things you want to try and do is surf some of those trends and try and get in there.
Awesome. Such great stuff in there. And, I know we're coming on time here. So before we close, would love for you to quickly share just some quick tips, suggestions based off of what we discussed. And then after that, I know you have a special offer you would like to share for our listeners. But first, what are some things some takeaways you would want our listeners to, walk away with?
I think probably three things, and sorry if I'm hammering on about them again, but let's do it. Why not? So the first one, that pithy pitch and that great story behind your game, but also your business and why you're doing things, really helps your story to cut through. Remember, you are going to be really effective by being personal And you're going to do that best by being targeted. Pick the right people, the right publications with the right story. That's going to help you sort of sail off towards success. And then I think the final point is sort of something that I think we've talked about, but maybe not fully summarized. So I'll try and put it here. Is ultimately reputation is the reason why you do your media relations work, but it's built in the long term. There's no quick fix. There's no quick hack. If someone says that they can get you in front of all of these people and you're going to be covered by all of these publications, they're lying to you. It's just not true. But if people say to you, yeah, actually, if you build a good long-term relationship with the press, with the media, and you build it over the course of many years, that can really deliver long-term rewards for you and what you're doing. And yeah, as you mentioned, so Video Games Industry Memo. So it's a weekly free newsletter, comes out every Thursday. It attempts to explain games in one quick newsletter. So the idea is you get one big read about an interesting element of games, news, job moves, the latest releases. So once a week, you can just look at it and do that. But I have a paid subscription service as well, which gives a load of extra insight for a couple of additional emails, which gives people offers to join events and things and all of those kinds of things early. And yeah, I'm working with a few partners as well to start feeding people with discounts and things like that. That's great. It doesn't cost a huge amount. It costs about $50 a year, but it definitely costs that if you use the code KEENBEAN, which you can find on Video Games Industry Memo before the 9th of July. And that will get you, I believe it's 20% off VGym forever, because I call Video Games Industry Memo VGym just for the sake of keeping things easy. So yeah, that's it really.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, that discount. And, as George said, it's really packed with all sorts of information. The Video Games Industry Memo, definitely worth checking it out. And yeah, that generous offer, Keen Bean, it will be available in the show notes. And it's available up until, July 9th. So check it out. And George, thank you for being here today. But if people want to connect or find out more about, Half-Space or whatever, what are some links that we can share, or a few main ones? We'll include others in the show notes as well.
Sure. So you can find Half-Space on the web. So it's half-space.consulting. Yeah, I found that there's a .consulting address now. Isn't that exciting? But you can find me there for Half-Space. But you can also find me for Video Games Industry Memo. That's much more easy to find in the sense of it's videogamesindustry.memo.com. If you want to email me, hit George at on either of those email addresses, on those web addresses. It'll get to me. You can also grab me on LinkedIn. I do bits and pieces on there, especially noodling around how you get press coverage from time to time, just the kind of a little extra thing. And if you really want to read my mad ramblings, you can go on X and find me at George Osborn, though I think it's fair to say we're all there a little bit less nowadays. But yeah, if at any point you want to contact me, feel free to get in touch. I'm very happy to talk.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, George, for all of this. It's been great and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Fantastic, Mo. Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.